The badge flashed in the darkness. The shove came hard and fast. Glass shattered. But what happened next would shake an entire police department to its core. The red and blue lights painted violent streaks across the federal courthouse parking garage that November night in Atlanta. Chief Bryson Kane stepped out of his cruiser, his jaw clenched with the kind of rage that had been building for weeks. Budget cuts, oversight complaints, and now this. Someone had called in about suspicious individuals, loitering near the federal building after hours, on his turf, his city. Nobody moves. Kane's voice boomed across the concrete, echoing off the walls as 4 court employees froze mid-conversation by their cars. They'd been discussing a case that had run late, nothing more. But to Kane, everything looked like a threat these days. That's when she stepped forward, calm, composed, carrying herself with a quiet authority that immediately set Kane's teeth on edge. Judge Naomi Pierce, though he didn't know her name yet. All he saw was a black woman in professional attire who dared to question his authority. "Is there a problem, officer?" Her voice was steady, measured. And that's where our story begins. I'm about to tell you how one police chief's abuse of power collided with the immovable force of federal law, and how a single moment of violence would unravel decades of corruption. Stay with me until the end, and drop a comment about what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories of justice travel. The federal courthouse parking garage sat like a concrete fortress in the heart of downtown Atlanta, its fluorescent lights humming against the November chill. At 9:47 p.m., the space should have been nearly empty, just the usual scatter of vehicles belonging to night shift security and the occasional late-working attorney. But tonight, 4 figures stood clustered near the elevator bank, their breath visible in the cold air, as they discussed the complexities of a civil rights case that had kept them all working past dinner. Chief Bryson Kane's cruiser swept into the garage with unnecessary speed tires squealing against the polished concrete. Behind him, 3 more patrol cars followed in tight formation, their lights transforming the mundane space into a chaos of shadows and glare. Kane had been having a bad month, hell, a bad year. Budget hearings that went nowhere, a city council increasingly interested in his department's use of force statistics, and a mayor who smiled for cameras while privately suggesting reforms that Kane saw as handcuffs on real police work. The 911 call had been vague, suspicious persons near federal property, possibly casing vehicles, but Kane had responded personally. He needed this. Needed to feel the weight of his authority, the respect his position demanded. At 48, with 26 years on the force, he'd earned the right to command this city's streets. "Everybody against the wall." His voice cracked like a whip as he emerged from his vehicle, hand already resting on his service weapon. The 4 court employees, 2 clerks, a stenographer, and Judge Naomi Pierce turned in surprise. They'd been discussing whether to grab coffee before the drive home, nothing more sinister than debating between Starbucks and the local place that stayed open late. Marcus Williams, one of the clerks, immediately raised his hands. "Officers, we work here. Federal employees. We're just—" "Did I ask you to speak?" Kane cut him off, his eyes scanning the group with practiced suspicion. In his mind, the narrative was already forming 4 people after hours in a secure area. The fact that 3 of them were black only reinforced his instincts, though he'd never admit that out loud, not even to himself. Judge Naomi Pierce watched Kane carefully. At 42, she'd spent enough years as a civil rights attorney before her federal appointment to recognize the dangerous cocktail of authority and anger radiating from the chief. She noted the badge number 1247 and the way his hand hadn't moved from his weapon. The security cameras mounted at regular intervals along the ceiling. The federal jurisdiction markers posted every 20 feet. "Chief Kane," she read from his nameplate, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that came from years of managing tense courtrooms. "We're federal employees. This is federal property. May I ask what probable cause you have for this stop?" Kane's eyes snapped to her, and something dark flickered across his face. Here was this woman, This black woman standing in her designer coat and speaking to him like she had any right to question his actions. The rage that had been simmering for weeks found its target. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back and keep your mouth shut while we conduct our investigation." Investigation of what exactly? Naomi didn't move her tone, remaining professionally neutral, even as she mentally cataloged every detail: the time, the badge numbers of the arriving officers, the precise location within federal jurisdiction. "We're happy to cooperate, but you should know this is federal." The shove came without warning. Kane's hands struck Naomi's shoulders with enough force to send her stumbling backward into the side of a parked Suburban. Her briefcase flew from her hand, legal documents scattering across the oil-stained concrete as she fought to keep her balance. The crack of her shoulder against the vehicle's mirror was audible even over the idling engines. "I said step back." Kane's face was inches from hers now, spittle flying as his control evaporated entirely. Behind him, several officers shifted uncomfortably. Deputy Patricia Ruiz, only 2 years on the force, instinctively reached for her body camera, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by her sergeant, who shook his head sharply. Naomi steadied herself against the vehicle, her shoulder throbbing. Years of courtroom experience had taught her to remain composed under pressure, but this was different. This was physical. This was a uniformed officer assaulting her on federal property while his colleagues watched. "Chief Kane," she said, her voice steady despite the pain. "You've just committed assault on federal property. Section 111 of Title 18. Lady, I don't give a damn about." The sudden wail of different sirens cut through his response. 2 black Suburbans with federal plates roared into the garage, and Kane's expression shifted from rage to confusion. U.S. Marshals. The vehicles positioned themselves, strategically effectively boxing in the local police cruisers. Marshal David Chen stepped out first, his hand on his weapon, but not drawn his eyes, taking in the scene with practiced efficiency. Scattered documents, a woman pressed against a vehicle, local law enforcement in an aggressive posture on federal property. "Stand down. Everyone stand down now." Chen's voice carried absolute authority. Unlike local police, federal marshals answered to the Department of Justice, not city politics. "This is federal property. Local law enforcement has no jurisdiction here without federal authorization." Kane straightened, trying to salvage his authority. "We received a suspicious persons call." "On federal property." Chen interrupted, then spoke into his radio. "This is Marshal Chen. We have a situation in the courthouse garage, requesting immediate supervisor response and—" He paused, his eyes finding Naomi, taking in her disheveled appearance, but composed demeanor. "Notification to the FBI Civil Rights Division." That's when Deputy Chief Harrison arrived, his face flushed as he took in the scene. He'd been monitoring radio traffic from home when he heard Kane's unit responding to the federal building. The last thing the department needed was a federal incident. "Chief Kane," Harrison said carefully, aware that every word was likely being recorded. "Perhaps we should—" "Your Honor." The words came from Marcus Williams, who had finally found his voice. Everyone turned to look at him, then followed his gaze to Naomi. "Your Honor," he repeated louder this time. "Judge Pierce, are you hurt?" The silence that followed was absolute. Even the idling engines seemed to quiet as the weight of those words settled over the scene. Chief Bryson Kane's face drained of color as his brain processed the impossibility of what he was hearing. Marshal Chen stepped forward, his expression hardening. "Judge Pierce, federal, Judge Naomi Pierce." Naomi straightened fully, her hand still pressed to her injured shoulder. "That's correct, Marshal. Judge Naomi Pierce, United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia. Badge number 1247, just assaulted me on federal property after I identified myself as a federal employee and questioned his probable cause for this stop." The transformation in the garage was immediate. Officers who had been standing in aggressive postures suddenly looked like they wanted to disappear into the concrete. Deputy Ruiz's hand moved to her body camera again, this time switching it on despite her sergeant's earlier warning. She knew what was coming. Internal investigations, federal oversight, possibly criminal charges. Better to be on record as the one who tried to document the truth. Kane's mouth opened and closed without sound. In 26 years of police work, he'd never felt the ground shift beneath him quite like this. A federal judge. Federal. He'd just physically assaulted a federal judge on federal property in front of witnesses with cameras recording everything. Judge Pierce, Marshal Chen said formally. Do you require medical attention? Document the injury first. Naomi replied, her legal mind already working through the procedures that would follow. Photographs, witness statements. Make sure the security footage is preserved. Cameras 7 through 12 should have captured everything. She knew those camera positions because she walked past them every day. She knew the federal statutes that had just been violated because she'd prosecuted similar cases as an attorney. And she knew that what had just happened to her was part of a pattern that had been protected and enabled for far too long. Harrison was on his phone now, his voice urgent but muted as he spoke to someone, likely the city attorney or the commissioner. Kane stood frozen, watching his deputy chief's face grow increasingly grim with each passing second. Chief Kane. Marshal Chen said, his tone formal and cold. I'm going to need you to step back to your vehicle and remain there. Do not leave the scene. FBI agents are en route. This is... Kane started, his voice cracking. This is a misunderstanding. We were responding to a call. Chief. Harrison's voice cut through Kane's protest. He'd ended his call, and his expression was that of a man watching a train wreck in slow motion. The commissioner wants you back at the station, now, he said. Harrison paused, glancing at the federal officers. He said to comply with all federal directives. The next few minutes unfolded with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that only comes from well-practiced disaster response. More federal vehicles arrived. FBI Special Agent Rachel Morrison from the Civil Rights Division stepped out of an unmarked sedan, her expression professionally neutral as she surveyed the scene. Behind her, a forensic photographer began documenting everything: the scattered legal documents, the damage to the vehicle's mirror, the visible injury to Judge Pierce's shoulder. Judge Pierce, Agent Morrison said, after introducing herself. I need to inform you that this incident falls under our jurisdiction. Potential violations include 18 U.S.C. 242 deprivation of rights under color of law, and 18 U.S.C. 111 assaulting a federal officer. Would you like to make a statement now, or would you prefer to do so after medical attention? I'll make a preliminary statement now, Naomi replied, her voice carrying across the now crowded garage. She wanted every officer present to hear this. At approximately 9:52 p.m. I was discussing work matters with my colleagues when Chief Kane and multiple officers arrived. When I identified myself as a federal employee and questioned the probable cause for the stop, Chief Kane physically assaulted me, shoving me into this vehicle with enough force to cause injury. This occurred after I explicitly mentioned federal jurisdiction. Deputy Ruiz stepped forward slightly, her body camera prominent on her chest. Agent Morrison, I have footage. My camera was running. Her Sergeant Dale Crawford shot her a venomous look. Deputy, you were instructed to follow department protocol. Ruiz finished, her voice stronger than she felt, which requires body camera activation during any enforcement action. This became an enforcement action the moment Chief Kane laid hands on Judge Pierce. It was a lie. She'd only turned it on after the assault, but she'd noticed something Kane hadn't. The federal building's external security system had been upgraded 6 months ago. The new cameras were nearly invisible, tucked into the concrete pillars, and they captured everything in 4K resolution with audio. Whatever her body camera had missed, the federal system had caught. Agent Morrison nodded approvingly at Ruiz. Deputy, please preserve that footage. Don't upload it to your department's server yet. We'll need to ensure chain of custody. The implication was clear to everyone present. The FBI didn't trust the local department to preserve evidence against their own chief. Kane's phone buzzed. Commissioner Robert Hayes. He answered with a hand that shook slightly. "Sir, Not on the phone." Hayes's voice was audible to those standing close. "Get back here now. Bring Harrison. Nobody else talks to the media. Nobody makes statements. Nobody does anything until legal briefs us. And Bryson. You better pray that judge doesn't have a scratch on her, or we're all finished." But it was already too late for prayers. As Kane walked back to his cruiser, he passed the spot where Naomi's briefcase had fallen. Among the scattered papers was a document he recognized, a draft judicial opinion on a civil rights case involving police accountability. The plaintiff's name was familiar, Deshaun Coleman, a young man whose complaint against Kane's department had been dismissed by Internal Affairs 6 months ago. Insufficient evidence, the report had concluded. Judge Pierce had been reviewing the case file. She'd been preparing to rule on whether the federal court had jurisdiction to investigate the department's pattern of dismissing complaints. And Kane had just given her all the evidence she needed. Harrison fell into step beside him, his voice low and urgent. "Bryson, tell me you didn't know she was a judge. Tell me this was just—" "I didn't know," Kane said, but even as the words left his mouth, he wondered if it mattered. He'd assaulted a woman for questioning his authority. The fact that she was a federal judge just determined the severity of the consequences, not the wrongness of the act. Behind them, Judge Pierce was giving detailed instructions to Marshal Chen about evidence preservation. Her shoulder throbbed, but her mind was crystal clear. This wasn't just about her. It never was. This was about every person who'd been shoved, struck, or worse by officers who believed their badges placed them above the law. The difference was that this time the victim understood the law better than the perpetrator. "Marshal Chen," she said loud enough for the local officers to hear, "please ensure all footage is preserved under federal chain of custody. I want every second from every angle. Also, please note that several officers witnessed the assault without intervening. Under federal law, failure to intervene in a civil rights violation is itself a violation." Sergeant Crawford's face went pale. He'd been standing less than 10 feet away when Kane shoved the judge. He'd seen it all and done nothing. Worse, he'd tried to prevent Ruiz from recording it. Agent Morrison approached the group of local officers. "I'm going to need all of you to remain available for questioning. This is now a federal investigation. Any attempts to coordinate statements or tamper with evidence will be considered obstruction of justice." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "That includes any communication with Internal Affairs about this incident. As of now, your Internal Affairs Division has no jurisdiction over this matter." The mention of Internal Affairs sent a ripple of unease through the officers. Everyone knew that Lieutenant James Grayson ran IA like his personal kingdom, and that complaints against certain officers, especially command staff, had a way of disappearing into bureaucratic black holes. But federal oversight was different. The FBI didn't care about department politics or thin blue lines. Kane sat in his cruiser watching through the windshield as Judge Pierce spoke with Agent Morrison. Even from a distance, he could see the judge was building a case, not just making a complaint. Every gesture was deliberate, every word chosen carefully. She wasn't acting like a victim. She was acting like a prosecutor who'd just been handed evidence on a silver platter. His phone rang again. This time it was Lieutenant Grayson from IA. "Chief, I heard there was an incident. Don't worry, we can—" "It's federal, Jim," Kane interrupted, his voice hollow. "FBI has it. We're locked out." The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds. When Grayson spoke again, his voice had lost its usual confidence. "Federal. Why would—" "I shoved a federal judge, Jim. On federal property. It's over." Another silence, longer this time. Then, "We need to talk. Not on the phone. There are some things, some files we need to discuss." Kane understood immediately. Grayson was already thinking about covering tracks about what a federal investigation might uncover if they started pulling threads. How many excessive force complaints had they buried together? How many officers had they protected? How many victims had they silenced with bureaucratic indifference? Jim, they have everything on camera, multiple angles. There's no fixing this. It's not just about tonight, Bryson. If the feds start digging, we need to coordinate. But coordination required trust, and trust was already fracturing. Deputy Ruiz was standing apart from the other officers, now closer to the federal agents than to her own colleagues. She'd made her choice and everyone could see it. Others would follow ambitious officers who saw which way the wind was blowing, younger cops who'd never been comfortable with how things were done, veterans tired of carrying the weight of other people's sins. Judge Pierce was now seated in one of the marshal's vehicles, an EMT examining her shoulder, while she continued to dictate observations to Agent Morrison. Her voice carried across the garage in fragments. Pattern of intimidation. Federal employees have reported. Previous incidents dismissed without investigation. Each phrase was another nail in a coffin Kane was only beginning to understand the size of. This wasn't going to be just about tonight. This was going to be about everything, every corner cut, every complaint buried, every victim ignored. The judge wasn't just pressing charges. She was building a federal civil rights case against the entire department. Harrison returned from a phone call, his face ashen. The mayor wants to see you and the commissioner first thing tomorrow. City attorney will be there. They're already talking about... He lowered his voice. Distance. Putting distance between the city and whatever happens next. Distance. Political speak for abandonment. Kane had been a good soldier for 26 years, had done what needed to be done to keep the city's crime stats low and the complaints quiet. But now he was a liability, and in politics, liabilities were disposed of quickly. "They're throwing me under the bus," Kane asked, though it wasn't really a question. "They're protecting the city," Harrison replied carefully. "The federal investigation is going to happen either way. The question is, whether it focuses on you or spreads to the whole department." The implication was clear. Take the fall alone or bring everyone down with you. But Kane knew it was already too late for that kind of damage control. Judge Pierce had said it herself, failure to intervene was also a violation. Every officer who'd stood by tonight was potentially liable. Every supervisor who'd signed off on questionable IA reports was exposed. Every official who'd looked the other way was vulnerable. A new vehicle arrived, a van with FBI evidence response team stenciled on the side. Technicians emerged with cases of equipment preparing to process the scene like it was a major crime, which Kane was beginning to understand it was. "Chief Kane," Agent Morrison approached his vehicle. "I need to advise you of your rights. You have the right to remain silent." "Am I under arrest?" The words came out strangled. "Not at this moment, but you're the subject of a federal investigation. I strongly advise you to obtain legal counsel before making any statements." She handed him a business card. "You'll need to provide your attorney's contact information within 24 hours. There will be a formal interview scheduled." As she walked away, Kane looked at the card. Federal Bureau of Investigation Civil Rights Division. Below that, a case number had already been assigned. The bureaucratic machinery was already in motion, grinding forward with the inexorable force of federal law. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife. "News saying something happened at Federal Building. Are you okay?" The news. Someone had leaked it already, probably one of the courthouse employees who'd witnessed everything. By morning, it would be everywhere. Social media, local news, probably national news, given that a federal judge was involved. The court of public opinion would convene long before any actual court. Through his windshield, Kane watched Judge Pierce stand up from the EMT's examination. Her shoulder was wrapped, now her arm in a sling, but she stood straight, dignified. She was speaking to her colleagues, the ones Kane had tried to intimidate, and he could see them nodding, their initial fear replaced by something else. Resolve, maybe. Or recognition that tonight had changed everything. The security footage would be damning, Kane knew. But it was what would come after that truly terrified him. Once the feds started investigating, they'd want to know why he'd responded so aggressively to a simple suspicious person's call. They'd want to see the patterns, which calls he responded to personally, which neighborhoods, which demographics. They'd pull his disciplinary records, his IA complaints, his radio traffic, his emails. God, the emails. How many times had he messaged Grayson about handling a complaint? How many times had he forwarded citizen concerns with dismissive comments? How many times had he put in writing the very attitudes that had led to tonight's explosion? Marshal Chen was now conferring with Agent Morrison, and Kane could see them gesturing toward the various cameras. The federal building's security system was state-of-the-art, installed after 9/11, and upgraded regularly. Every angle, every word, every expression would have been captured in high definition. There would be no ambiguity about what happened, no competing narratives to muddy the waters. Deputy Ruiz approached the federal agents again, and Kane strained to hear what she was saying. Other incidents. Officers have talked about. Never felt I could report. She was flipping. Right there in front of everyone, she was offering to cooperate with the federal investigation. And she wouldn't be the last. Once the first domino fell, others would follow officers who'd been passed over for promotion, those who'd been pressured to stay quiet, those who'd lost faith in the system they'd sworn to serve. Commissioner Hayes arrived, stepping out of his unmarked car with the kind of forced calm that came from years of managing crises. He surveyed the scene, federal agents processing evidence, his chief sitting isolated in his cruiser, Judge Pierce, giving what appeared to be a formal statement, and Kane could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. Hayes approached Agent Morrison, his hand extended. Agent Morrison, I'm Commissioner Hayes. I want to assure you that the department will cooperate fully with your investigation. Morrison shook his hand briefly. Commissioner, I'll need all relevant records by tomorrow afternoon. That includes internal affairs files, body camera footage, radio traffic, and email communications. I'm also implementing a preservation order. Nothing gets deleted. Nothing gets modified. Of course, Hayes replied smoothly, though Kane noticed the slight tightening around his eyes. The commissioner had his own secrets, his own questionable decisions that a thorough investigation might uncover. Hayes then walked over to Kane's cruiser, leaning down to the window. His voice was low-controlled, but Kane could hear the fury underneath. 26 years, Bryson. 26 years of building this department's reputation, and you destroy it in 30 seconds. Do you have any idea what you've done? She was questioning my authority. She's a federal judge, Hayes hissed. She could have questioned your ancestry, and you still don't lay hands on her. You've given them exactly what they've been looking for, an excuse to come after all of us. All of us. So Hayes understood too. This wouldn't stop with Kane. The infection was too deep, the rot too widespread. Once the feds started pulling threads, the entire fabric would unravel. A news van pulled up to the garage entrance, stopped by federal marshals who'd established a perimeter. But telephoto lenses were already extending, reporters speaking urgently into cameras. The story was out, spreading like wildfire through the digital ecosystem. Judge Pierce finished her statement and walked toward the garage exit, flanked by marshals. She moved carefully, protecting her injured shoulder, but her bearing was unbowed. As she passed Kane's cruiser, she paused for just a moment, meeting his eyes through the windshield. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction, just a kind of weary determination that Kane recognized, the look of someone who'd been fighting a war for a long time and had just won a crucial battle. But the war itself was far from over. Judge Pierce, a reporter shouted from behind the perimeter. Can you comment on what happened here tonight? She paused at the garage entrance, considering. Then she turned to face the cameras, her voice carrying the same calm authority she'd displayed throughout the ordeal. Tonight, a law enforcement officer forgot that in America, no badge stands above the Constitution. The federal investigation will proceed according to the law, and justice will be served not just for me, but for everyone whose rights have been violated under color of authority. She paused, then added, The law applies equally to everyone, or it means nothing at all. As she disappeared into a waiting vehicle, Kane felt the weight of those words settle over him like a burial shroud. The law applies equally to everyone. For 26 years, he'd operated under a different understanding that the law was a tool to be wielded by those in power, bent when necessary, ignored when convenient. But tonight, he'd collided with someone who understood the law differently, who saw it not as a weapon, but as a shield for the vulnerable. His phone was ringing again. His wife, the union rep. An unknown number that was probably a reporter. He ignored them all, sitting in the artificial twilight of the garage, watching federal agents methodically document his destruction. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and strategies, damage control, and spin. But tonight, in this moment, Kane understood with perfect clarity that his life as he'd known it was over. The badge that had defined him, elevated him, protected him for so long, had become the very thing that would destroy him. Agent Morrison approached his vehicle one more time. "Chief Kane, we're going to need you to come to the federal building tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. sharp. Bring your attorney." He nodded mutely. What else was there to say? As the federal agents continued their work, as the reporters gathered like vultures, as his fellow officers avoided eye contact and whispered among themselves. Bryson Kane sat alone in his cruiser and wondered how many others would fall with him. Lieutenant Grayson, with his buried complaints. Commissioner Hayes with his political machinations. The sergeants who'd looked the other way. The entire system that had enabled and protected men like him for so long. The garage's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, that same monotonous drone that had announced his arrival. But now it sounded different, less like authority, and more like judgment. The cameras that had recorded his assault would be evidence. The federal property he'd violated would be his downfall. The judge he'd pushed would be the catalyst for changes he'd spent his entire career resisting. Deputy Ruiz was leaving now, walking past his cruiser without a glance. She'd chosen her side, and others would follow. By morning, the department would be split between those scrambling for cover and those seeking redemption through cooperation. The thin blue line had been shattered by a single shove, a moment of rage that had exposed the deeper violence of a system built on impunity. Kane's radio crackled dispatch announcing a robbery in progress across town. For the first time in 26 years, he felt no urge to respond, no thrill of authority. He was just a man sitting in a car wearing a uniform that no longer meant what he'd thought it did, carrying a badge that had become evidence of his crimes rather than a shield against accountability. The federal investigation would be thorough, he knew. Morrison had that look, the patient, methodical demeanor of someone who understood that justice was a marathon, not a sprint. They would excavate every buried complaint, illuminate every dark corner, expose every carefully constructed lie. And when they were done, the department he'd helped build would be unrecognizable. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps Judge Pierce had understood something in that moment, when he'd shoved her, that sometimes systems were so broken they couldn't be reformed, only demolished and rebuilt. And perhaps his violence, born of rage and prejudice and unchecked power, had been the catalyst necessary for that demolition. As midnight approached, the garage began to empty. Evidence collected, statements taken, the immediate crisis managed. But the reverberations would continue for months, maybe years. Federal monitors, consent decrees, criminal trials. The machinery of justice would grind slowly, but inevitably, toward its conclusion. Kane started his engine, preparing to drive to the station, where the commissioner waited with lawyers and crisis managers. But first he took one last look at the spot where it had happened, where his hand had struck out in anger and set in motion his own destruction. The scattered papers from Judge Pierce's briefcase had been collected as evidence, but he could still see them in his mind. Documents about accountability, about justice, about the Constitution he'd sworn to uphold. Tomorrow, the real investigation would begin. Phone records would be subpoenaed, hard drives, copied testimonies compelled. The careful architecture of corruption and complicity would be mapped and dismantled. Some would cooperate. Others would resist, but the outcome was already determined. The federal government had been challenged on its own ground, and it would respond with the full weight of its authority. As Chief Bryson Kane drove out of the garage and into the Atlanta night, he carried with him the knowledge that he had become the architect of his own downfall. One shove. One moment of unchecked authority. One collision with someone who understood that true power came not from a badge, but from the law itself. Behind him, the federal courthouse stood illuminated against the darkness, its cameras still recording its halls, still echoing with the promise that justice, however delayed, would not be denied. The system that had protected him for so long would now consume him, and in that consumption, perhaps something better might be born. The investigation was just beginning. The morning sun hadn't yet reached the windows of the federal building when Agent Rachel Morrison's team began assembling in Conference Room 12A. Coffee cups steamed on the long table, laptops hummed to life, and the wall-mounted screen displayed a timeline that would become the backbone of their investigation. It was 6:47 a.m., less than 9 hours since Chief Kane's hand had struck Judge Pierce, but the federal machinery was already in full motion. "All right, people." Morrison addressed her team of 6 agents, each chosen for their specific expertise. "We have authorization for a full pattern and practice investigation. This isn't just about last night's assault. We're looking at systemic violations going back at least 5 years. Agent David Park, a forensic accountant who'd helped take down corrupt departments in Baltimore and New Orleans, was already deep in financial records. "I've got something interesting already," he said, pulling up a spreadsheet. "The department's legal settlement fund has paid out $3.2 million in the last 18 months. But here's the thing, none of these settlements appear in public records. They're being routed through a private insurance subsidiary that technically isn't subject to FOIA requests." Morrison leaned forward. "How many cases?" "At least 47 that I can identify so far. All settled with NDAs, all processed through the same law firm, all signed off by..." Park paused, double-checking his screen. "Lieutenant James Grayson from Internal Affairs." The name hung in the air. Grayson had been mentioned in Judge Pierce's initial statement as someone who'd systematically dismissed complaints against senior officers. Now, they had a money trail. "Sarah," Morrison turned to Agent Sarah Chen, their digital forensics specialist. "What do we have from the courthouse cameras?" Chen pulled up the footage on the main screen, multiple angles synced to show the assault from every perspective. "It's worse than just the shove," she said, freezing the frame at the moment of impact. "Look at Officer Crawford here. He actually steps forward to block this angle, trying to obstruct the view. And Deputy Ruiz's body camera. Someone remotely triggered a maintenance cycle at 9:51 p.m., 1 minute before Kane arrived. It was supposed to stop recording. Supposed to. The federal building's Wi-Fi intercepted the signal. Our IT security flagged it as an anomalous command. The camera kept recording, but someone at dispatch tried to shut it down." Chen pulled up a command log. "The kill signal came from Terminal 7 at the department. That terminal is assigned to Dispatch Supervisor Elena Volkov." Morrison made a note. Every thread they pulled revealed 2 more. The corruption wasn't just deep. It was systematic, coordinated, practiced. This wasn't the first time they'd tried to bury evidence. It was just the first time they'd been caught in the act. A knock at the door interrupted them. Marshal Chen entered with a flash drive. "Judge Pierce just sent this over. She's been keeping records for the past 2 years, ever since she started noticing federal employees being harassed near the courthouse. Dates, times, badge numbers, everything." Morrison plugged in the drive, and dozens of files appeared. Incident reports that Judge Pierce had meticulously documented, but never formally filed, waiting for the right moment or the right case. Photos of federal employees pushed against walls, videos of aggressive traffic stops that just happened to occur right outside federal property, audio recordings of officers making threats. "Jesus," Park whispered, opening one file. "She's built an entire RICO case. This could qualify as racketeering, organized criminal activity under color of law." The door opened again, and this time it was someone unexpected. Deputy Patricia Ruiz, still in uniform, but looking like she hadn't slept. "Agent Morrison, I know my interview isn't until 10, but I couldn't wait. There's something you need to know. Something about tonight, about why Chief Kane was really there." Morrison gestured to a chair. "Deputy, you should have your attorney present." "I don't need an attorney. I need witness protection." Ruiz's hands shook as she pulled out her personal phone. Last night wasn't random. They knew Judge Pierce would be working late. They've been monitoring her. She showed them a text thread from a burner phone. The messages were cryptic but clear enough. "Package at the courthouse tonight. After 9. Make sure it's handled." "Who sent these?" Morrison asked. "I don't know the source, but they came through Grayson's network. He has a whole system, burner phones distributed to loyal officers, changed out monthly. He calls it operational security. But really, it's about coordinating off-the-record enforcement actions." Chen was already tracing the phone numbers, her fingers flying across her keyboard. These phones were all purchased from the same store, all activated within minutes of each other, all paid for with prepaid cards bought with cash, but... She paused, a smile creeping across her face. The store's camera caught the buyer, Lieutenant James Grayson himself. 6 months ago, buying 30 phones. Morrison stood up at the pieces falling into place. They've been running a parallel communication system. That's how they coordinate witness intimidation, evidence suppression, everything. And last night was supposed to be a message, Ruiz finished. Judge Pierce has been reviewing police brutality cases, possibly preparing a major ruling. They wanted to scare her to make her think twice. But Kane lost control. He wasn't supposed to actually assault her, just intimidate her and her staff. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just excessive force or even simple corruption. This was an organized conspiracy to obstruct justice, to intimidate federal officials, to subvert the entire legal system. Morrison's phone rang. It was Director Johnson from the Civil Rights Division in Washington. She stepped aside to take the call, but everyone could hear his voice through the phone. "Rachel, this is now a Priority 1 investigation. The Attorney General has been briefed. You have whatever resources you need." "And Rachel, there's something else. Judge Pierce wasn't the only federal official they've been watching. We've identified at least 3 other judges and 2 federal prosecutors on their target list." As Morrison ended the call, her team was already moving. This had just escalated from a local corruption case to a federal conspiracy investigation. The entire Atlanta Police Department was now under scrutiny, and the reverberations would reach into City Hall, the state capitol, maybe even further. Meanwhile, 3 blocks away in the offices of Hartley Brennan and Associates, Chief Bryson Kane sat across from Marcus Brennan, one of Atlanta's most expensive defense attorneys. The mahogany table between them was covered with legal documents, each one another nail in Kane's professional coffin. "Bryson, I'm going to be straight with you," Brennan said, removing his glasses. "The assault charge alone could get you 5 years federal time, but that's not what worries me. It's what they're going to find when they start digging." Kane's face was haggard, aged 10 years overnight. "It was one shove, Marcus. One mistake." "Stop." Brennan held up his hand. "First of all, never minimize what you did, especially not in front of a jury. Second, we both know this isn't about one shove. I've been making calls. The FBI has already issued 17 subpoenas. They've seized the internal affairs servers. They have your emails, your texts, everything. Attorney-client privilege. Doesn't apply to ongoing criminal conspiracies. Bryson, I've reviewed your department emails from the discovery packet the feds just sent. You have messages explicitly telling Grayson to handle certain complaints. You have exchanges with the commissioner about managing federal oversight. You have a deleted folder that IT recovered containing photographs of federal officials with their home addresses and daily routines. Do you understand what that looks like?" Kane's hands clenched on the table. Of course he understood. It looked like exactly what it was, a systematic campaign of surveillance and intimidation designed to prevent federal oversight of the department. "What are my options?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Cooperate. Full cooperation. Tell them everything, every buried complaint, every cover-up, every official who was involved. In exchange, maybe we can get you down to 18 months, 2 years maximum. That's not an option. Kane's voice was flat. You don't understand the network, Marcus. These people, they reach everywhere. Judges, prosecutors, state officials. If you don't flip, you're looking at 20 years minimum. RICO charges Bryson. They're building a RICO case. That's not just jail time. That's federal supermax, that's asset forfeiture, that's your pension, your house, everything. Before Kane could respond, Brennan's assistant knocked and entered. Mr. Brennan, you need to see the news. She turned on the wall-mounted television, and there was Judge Pierce standing outside the federal courthouse, her arms still in a sling, but her voice strong and clear. Behind her stood 3 other federal judges and 2 U.S. attorneys. This morning, Judge Pierce was saying, we filed an emergency petition for federal oversight of the Atlanta Police Department. The pattern of civil rights violations, the systematic suppression of complaints, and the targeting of federal officials cannot be allowed to continue. Effective immediately, all internal affairs investigations will be reviewed by federal monitors, and any officer who has witnessed or participated in civil rights violations is encouraged to come forward. Whistleblower protections will be enforced to the fullest extent of the law. The camera zoomed in on her face, and Kane could see the determination there. This wasn't about revenge, it was about transformation. She was going to tear down everything he'd built and rebuild it from the ground up. Additionally, Judge Pierce continued, we are establishing a citizen review board with full subpoena power. No longer will police investigate themselves. No longer will complaints disappear into bureaucratic black holes. The citizens of Atlanta deserve better, and they're going to get it. Brennan muted the television. She's declaring war on your entire system. And Bryson, she's going to win. The only question is whether you're going to be buried under the rubble or whether you're going to help her tear it down. Back at the federal building, Agent Morrison was interviewing Detective Carl Washington, a 15-year veteran who'd walked in without a lawyer, without a deal, just a man who'd reached his breaking point. I've been keeping notes, Washington said, sliding a notebook across the table. Every time IA buried a case, every time evidence disappeared, every time a witness suddenly changed their story. 5 years of documentation. Morrison flipped through the pages, each one dated and detailed. Why didn't you come forward sooner? You ever try to report a corrupt cop when the entire chain of command is corrupt? I went to the sergeant, he told me to forget it. I went to the lieutenant, he transferred me to night shift. I went to the captain. Suddenly, I'm getting written up for every minor infraction. The message was clear. Stay quiet or get destroyed. What changed? Washington looked her in the eye. Judge Pierce, when I saw what Kane did to her, when I saw him assault a federal judge on camera and still think he could get away with it, I realized how deep the sickness went. And when I saw Deputy Ruiz step forward this morning, saw her choose justice over the thin blue line, I knew it was time. He pulled out another item, a flash drive. That contains audio recordings. I've been wearing a wire for the past 3 months, recording every conversation about buried cases. It's all there. Grayson bragging about his perfect internal affairs record. Kane discussing how to pressure witnesses, even Commissioner Hayes talking about managing federal oversight. Morrison plugged in the drive, and Washington's claim proved accurate. Hours of audio, each file meticulously labeled with date, time, and participants. The corruption wasn't just systemic, it was casual, discussed as openly as vacation plans or sports scores. One recording stood out. It was from a week ago, a conversation between Grayson and Kane in the chief's office. The Pierce situation needs to be handled, Grayson's voice said. She's reviewing the Coleman case, the Martinez lawsuit, 3 others. If she rules against us... I know what happens if she rules against us, Kane's voice responded. Federal oversight consent decree, the whole 9 yards. So what do? We remind her that federal judges aren't untouchable. They shop for groceries, They walk their dogs, they have families. Sometimes, people need to be reminded that the badge reaches everywhere. Morrison stopped the recording. That conversation alone was conspiracy to intimidate a federal official worth 10 years in federal prison. Combined with the actual assault, Kane was looking at decades behind bars. "Detective Washington," Morrison said formally, "would you be willing to testify to the authenticity of these recordings?" "I'll testify to everything. Every buried case, every threatened witness, every time justice was perverted for the sake of protecting bad cops. I'm done being silent." As Washington left, Morrison's phone buzzed with a text from Chen. "You need to see this, now." She rushed back to the conference room where Chen had pulled up financial records on the screen. "I've been tracking the settlement money, following it backward from the insurance subsidiary. Look where it originates." The screen showed a complex web of transactions, but at the center was a single account, the Atlanta Police Benevolent Association, the union. "They've been using union dues to pay off victims," Chen explained. "Every officer contributes whether they know it or not. The money gets laundered through 3 shell companies before reaching the insurance subsidiary. It's brilliant in its corruption. They've made every single officer financially complicit in the cover-ups." Park was running calculations on his laptop. "Based on these numbers, they've paid out over $12 million in the last 5 years. That's $12 million in taxpayer-funded union dues used to silence victims of police brutality." Morrison felt the scope of the investigation expanding again. This wasn't just about a few bad actors. The entire structure of the department was built on corruption, funded by corruption, protected by corruption. Her phone rang. It was Director Johnson again. "Rachel, I'm flying down this afternoon with a full task force. 20 agents, forensic accountants, a team from the Public Corruption Unit. The Attorney General is considering federal receivership of the entire department." Federal receivership, it had only happened a handful of times in history when local law enforcement was so corrupt that the federal government had to take direct control. It was the nuclear option, and it was now on the table. At the Atlanta Police Department headquarters, panic was setting in. Officers huddled in small groups, whispering about subpoenas and immunity deals. The parking lot was full of personal vehicles as officers came in on their day off to clear out their lockers, remove personal items, delete what they could before the feds arrived. Commissioner Hayes stood in his office, looking out at the city he'd sworn to protect. Behind him, 3 lawyers from the city attorney's office were arguing about strategy. "We need to get ahead of this," one was saying. "Announce our own investigation, implement immediate reforms." "It's too late for that," another interrupted. "The feds have everything. Our only option is damage control. Try to limit the scope." "Gentlemen," Hayes said, without turning around, "you're rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. This department is finished. The question isn't whether we survive, it's whether we go to prison." His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Commissioner, we should talk. I have information about the union funds. Meet me at the usual place in 1 hour. Come alone." Hayes knew he shouldn't go. Every instinct told him it was either a trap or an attempt to coordinate stories. But he also knew that the union held secrets that could destroy not just careers, but lives. The usual place was a parking garage downtown, the same one where they'd met before to discuss arrangements. As he prepared to leave, his secretary knocked. "Commissioner, there's a marshal here with a subpoena." Hayes walked out to find Marshal Chen waiting with a thick envelope. "Commissioner Hayes, you're required to appear before a federal grand jury tomorrow at 9 a.m. You're also served with a preservation order for all documents, electronic communications, and records. Any destruction of evidence will be prosecuted as obstruction of justice." Hayes took the envelope with steady hands, though inside he felt his world crumbling. A grand jury meant they were seeking indictments. Criminal indictments. His 40-year career in law enforcement was about to end with him in handcuffs. Lieutenant James Grayson was having his own crisis. Barricaded in his internal affairs office, he was frantically running a program to wipe his hard drives. But every time he tried, a federal warning popped up on his screen. This device is subject to federal monitoring. Any attempt to delete files has been logged and will be prosecuted. They were already in the system. The feds had probably been monitoring them for days, maybe weeks, waiting for the right moment to strike. And Kane's assault on Judge Pierce had given them that moment. His phone rang, a burner phone he kept for special communications. It was text-to-speech disguised voice. "Grayson, you're blown. They have everything. The only question is whether you hang alone or take everyone with you. Think carefully about your next move." The line went dead. Grayson understood the threat. Stay silent and go to prison for decades, or cooperate and face the wrath of a network that reached into every corner of law enforcement, politics, and organized crime. He thought about his pension, 23 years of service about to vanish. His house mortgage to pay for his daughter's college would be seized as proceeds of corruption. His reputation, carefully built through years of being the department's fixer, would be destroyed. But mostly, he thought about the victims. All those people whose complaints he'd buried, whose bruises he'd dismissed, whose stories he'd rewritten to protect officers like Kane. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of what he'd done. His computer dinged with a new email. It was from Agent Morrison, sent to his official department address. The subject line was simple: "Cooperation agreement available, time sensitive." She was offering him a way out, or at least a way to minimize the damage. But cooperation meant betraying everyone: Kane Hayes, the union bosses, the city officials who'd looked the other way. It meant becoming the most hated man in Atlanta law enforcement. Another email arrived, this one from an encrypted address. "Remember your family, Jim. Your daughter's at Emory Wright Beautiful Campus. Be a shame if her scholarship got revoked. If her apartment had a drug raid. If her boyfriend got pulled over every day. Think about what matters most." The threats were clear. Cooperate with the feds and his family would suffer. Stay silent and he'd rot in prison while they lived in poverty and shame. There was no good option, only degrees of destruction. Back at the federal building, Judge Pierce was meeting with the other federal judges and prosecutors who'd been targeted. The conference room was full of anger, but also determination. "They photographed my children at school," Judge Martinez was saying. "Had their daily schedules mapped out. What kind of police force does that? A force that thinks it's above the law." Judge Pierce replied, her injured shoulder a constant reminder of that hubris. "But they miscalculated. They thought intimidation would work on us like it worked on civilians. They didn't understand that federal judges don't intimidate easily." U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh pulled up a document on her laptop. "I've drafted the RICO indictment. 37 defendants so far, including Kane Grayson, 3 captains, 12 sergeants, and multiple union officials. The charges include conspiracy, obstruction of justice, deprivation of civil rights, witness tampering, and extortion." "What about Hayes?" Judge Martinez asked. "He's named as an unindicted co-conspirator for now. We're hoping he'll flip. A commissioner's testimony would be devastating to their defense." Judge Pierce stood wincing slightly at her shoulder. "This isn't just about convictions. It's about transformation. We need to tear out the corruption by its roots and plant something better. That means new policies, new oversight, new accountability measures that can't be circumvented by the next generation of corrupt cops." She walked to the window, looking out at the city. "Every person who's been brutalized, every complaint that's been buried, every family that's been threatened, they deserve justice, and we're going to give it to them even if we have to dismantle the entire department to do it." At that moment, across the city, Chief Bryson Kane sat in his home office, looking at a photograph from his swearing-in ceremony 6 years ago. He'd been so proud that day, achieving the pinnacle of his career. Now, he was about to become the face of police corruption, his name forever linked with the downfall of the department he'd sworn to lead. His wife entered, her face drawn with worry. "Bryson, there are reporters outside. The neighbors are asking questions. What do I tell them?" "Tell them." He paused, searching for words that wouldn't come. How do you explain that everything you've built was rotten? That the respect you commanded was based on fear, that the badge you wore with pride had become a symbol of oppression? Tell them nothing, he finally said. Marcus will handle the media. She sat beside him, taking his hand. Did you do what they're saying? Did you really assault a federal judge? Kane couldn't meet her eyes. I pushed her. She was questioning my authority, and I lost control. That's not what I'm asking, and you know it. The news is saying this is bigger than just last night. They're saying you've been covering up brutality cases, threatening witnesses, running the department like a criminal organization. Is it true? The silence stretched between them, heavy with 25 years of marriage and the weight of unspoken truths. How many? She finally asked. How many people did you hurt? How many complaints did you bury? I don't know, Kane admitted, and it was true. The number had become meaningless over the years. Each buried complaint, just another piece of paperwork. Each victim, just another problem to be managed. My God. Bryson. My God. His phone buzzed with a text from Brennan. Feds rejected our initial offer. They want names, dates, everything. You have 1 hour to decide. Full cooperation, or they're seeking life without parole under RICO. Life without parole. The words echoed in his mind. From chief of police to dying in federal prison. All because he couldn't control his temper when a black woman dared to question his authority. But no, that wasn't true, and he knew it. This was the culmination of decades of choices, each one moving him further from the oath he'd taken as a rookie. To protect and serve had become to dominate and control. The badge had become a license for lawlessness, and now the bill had come due. Kane's decision came at 3:47 p.m., sitting in Brennan's office with federal prosecutors across the table. His hands trembled as he signed the cooperation agreement, each signature another nail in the coffin of his former life. Agent Morrison watched him with an expression that wasn't quite sympathy, but perhaps understanding, the look of someone who'd seen powerful men crumble before. Let's start with the Coleman case, Morrison said, pulling up a file on her tablet. Deshaun Coleman filed an excessive force complaint 6 months ago. Internal Affairs marked it unsubstantiated. What really happened? Kane's throat was dry. Speaking these truths aloud felt like swallowing broken glass. Coleman was telling the truth. Officer Derek Matthews broke his ribs during a traffic stop. There was dashcam footage showing Matthews kicking him while he was handcuffed on the ground. Where's that footage now? Destroyed. Grayson handled it personally. He has a program that overwrites specific segments of video while keeping the timestamp integrity intact. Makes it look like a technical glitch. Morrison's team was recording everything, 2 stenographers capturing every word. Who else knew? Matthews Sergeant Tony Valdez, the shift captain Robert Chen, and... Kane paused, the next name sticking in his throat. Commissioner Hayes. I briefed him personally. He said to make it go away. The prosecutors exchanged glances. Hayes' involvement at that level changed everything. This wasn't just negligent oversight, it was active participation in obstruction of justice. Tell us about the union funds, Morrison continued. Detective Washington's recordings mention a war chest for legal defense. Kane laughed bitterly. Legal defense, that's what we called it. Really, it was hush money. Every officer paid an extra $40 monthly in special assessment dues. That money went into accounts controlled by Union President Michael Torres. When someone threatened to sue or go public, Torres would make them an offer: cash settlement, no admission of wrongdoing, strict NDA. How much money are we talking about? Over the past 5 years, maybe 15 million, maybe more. Torres kept the real books in his home, safe off-site from Union headquarters. Agent Park, the forensic accountant, looked up from his laptop. We tracked 12 million so far. Where's the other 3? Kane's next words would doom several more people. Kickbacks. City council members who voted against police accountability measures. Journalists who buried stories. even a few judges who consistently ruled in our favor. The room fell silent. The corruption extended beyond the police department into the very fabric of city governance. Morrison leaned forward. "Names, Chief Kane. We need names." As Kane began listing names across the city, Lieutenant James Grayson was making his own choice. But instead of cooperating, he was destroying everything. Not digitally, the feds had locked him out of that, but physically. In the basement of his home, he fed document after document into a burning barrel, watching years of evidence turn to ash. His wife stood at the basement door watching him with a mixture of fear and disgust. "Jim, what are you doing if the FBI finds out?" "They already know everything that matters," Grayson replied, adding another stack of papers to the fire. "These are insurance policies, Linda, names and dates that certain people wouldn't want public. If I'm going down, I'm not going alone." The papers contained something the FBI didn't know about yet, a parallel operation that went beyond covering up police brutality. For years, Grayson had been running a side business using internal affairs intelligence to identify vulnerable citizens for exploitation. Drug addicts who could be turned into informants, immigrants who could be extorted, sex workers who could be forced into compromising situations with targets of investigation. His phone rang. Commissioner Hayes calling from his personal cell. "Jim, we need to talk. Not on the phone. Memorial Park, 1 hour." "That's insane. The feds are probably watching." "1 hour, Jim. Or I go to Morrison myself and tell her about Tampa." Tampa. The word hit Grayson like ice water. 5 years ago, a conference in Tampa where a witness against the department had mysteriously disappeared. Only 3 people knew what really happened that night: Grayson, Hayes, and Kane. "I'll be there," Grayson said, ending the call. He grabbed his service weapon from the safe, checked the magazine, and tucked it into his waistband. If Hayes was planning to eliminate loose ends, Grayson intended to be ready. At Memorial Park, Hayes sat on a bench overlooking the lake, appearing to feed ducks, but actually scanning for surveillance. When Grayson arrived, the lieutenant sat at the opposite end of the bench, maintaining distance, like 2 strangers sharing public space. "The feds have Kane," Hayes said without preamble. "He flipped 2 hours ago. He's giving them everything." "Then we're finished." "Maybe not." Hayes pulled out a burner phone, showed Grayson a text message. "This came from our friend in the state attorney's office. They're offering us a deal, state immunity, in exchange for testimony against the federal prosecutors. Claim the feds are overreaching, that this is a state matter." Grayson read the message twice, understanding the implications. "They want us to start a jurisdiction war, muddy the waters. It could buy us time, maybe even get some charges dropped. But we'd need to coordinate our stories, present a united front." "What about Kane?" Hayes's expression hardened. "Kane made his choice. Now he lives with the consequences." Neither man noticed the van parked across the street, its tinted windows concealing FBI surveillance equipment that was capturing every word through parabolic microphones. Agent Chen sat in the back, headphones on, transcribing the conversation in real time. The friend in the state attorney's office was about to become another target of investigation. Back at the federal building, Judge Pierce was reviewing the first batch of unsealed indictments when her clerk knocked. "Your Honor, there's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent." The visitor was Detective Angela Martinez, a 15-year veteran who'd been one of the few female officers to speak out against the department's culture. She looked exhausted, haunted even. "Judge Pierce, I know I should go through official channels, but there's something you need to know immediately. It's about tonight." Pierce set aside her documents. "What about tonight?" "There's going to be a raid, off the books, no warrants. Torres and some union hardliners plan to hit the homes of officers who've cooperated with the FBI. They're calling it cleaning house. My partner's one of them. He thinks I'm loyal, so he told me." Pierce immediately called Morrison, putting her on speaker. "Agent Morrison, we have a credible threat against witness safety." Martinez provided addresses, times, even the vehicles they'd be using. "They're going to make it look like gang retaliation, use stolen cars, untraceable weapons. They've done it before. Any cop who crossed the thin blue line ended up having accidents or random attacks. Morrison's response was swift. "We're mobilizing tactical teams now. Detective Martinez, we need you to come in immediately for your own safety." "I can't. If I disappear, they'll know someone warned you. I need to play along, act normal. But please protect the others." As Martinez left, Pierce felt the weight of the situation. This wasn't just corruption anymore, it was potential murder. The department wasn't just fighting the investigation, they were willing to kill their own to protect their secrets. At 8 p.m., the raids began, but not the ones Torres had planned. FBI tactical teams swept through Atlanta simultaneously, hitting 7 locations at once. Torres was arrested at his home, caught with weapons, and a detailed plan for attacking cooperating witnesses. 3 Union officials were taken at the Union Hall, where they were shredding documents. 2 sergeants were arrested at a bar where they were coordinating alibis. The surprise was total. Someone had compromised their plan, but they didn't know who. Suspicion would tear them apart from within, each wondering who had betrayed them. Kane watched the arrests on the news from his home, now under federal protective custody. Each arrestee was someone he'd worked with, someone he'd trusted, someone who was now facing decades in prison because of the culture he'd helped create. His phone rang. Brennan calling with an update. "Bryson, your cooperation is already paying dividends. Based on your information, they've seized evidence that implicates 47 officers in various crimes. The DA is preparing the largest RICO case in Georgia history." "How long will I be in protective custody?" "Until the trials are over. Maybe 18 months, maybe longer. After that..." Brennan paused. "You'll need to relocate. You can never return to Atlanta, probably not anywhere in Georgia. You'll be looking over your shoulder for the rest of your life." The rest of his life. Kane thought about the power he'd wielded just days ago, the fear and respect his position commanded. Now he was a prisoner in his own home, waiting to testify against his former brothers in blue. His wife had left that afternoon, taking only a suitcase and leaving her wedding ring on the kitchen counter. 25 years of marriage ended by his choices. His children wouldn't speak to him. His son, a rookie officer in another state, had texted a simple message: "You've destroyed everything Dad stood for." But had he stood for anything worth preserving? The question haunted Kane as he sat in his empty house surrounded by commendations and awards that now seemed like mockeries of justice. Meanwhile, Grayson had made a different choice. Instead of accepting arrest, he'd fled. Using fake identification he'd prepared years ago for just such an emergency, he was driving toward the state line in a car registered to a dead man. But the FBI was already tracking him through cell tower pings from the burner phone he'd foolishly kept. At a rest stop near the Tennessee border, Grayson stopped to destroy the phone. As he stepped out of his car, he saw them 2 black SUVs boxing him in, agents emerging with weapons drawn. "Lieutenant Grayson, FBI, show us your hands." For a moment, Grayson considered reaching for his weapon. Suicide by federal agent would be easier than what awaited him: trial, conviction, decades in prison as a former cop. But his hand froze. Despite everything, he didn't want to die. He raised his hands, and they took him down hard, face pressed against the asphalt as they cuffed him. "James Grayson, you're under arrest for conspiracy to violate civil rights, obstruction of justice, and attempted flight to avoid prosecution." As they drove him back to Atlanta, Grayson stared out the window at the city lights, knowing it was probably the last time he'd see them as a free man. The next morning, the scope of the investigation exploded across national news. "Massive corruption scandal rocks Atlanta police," dominated headlines. Cable news ran continuous coverage, bringing in experts to discuss the implications. Social media erupted with stories from victims who'd been silenced for years, finally able to speak their truth. Judge Pierce held a press conference at the federal courthouse, her arm still in a sling, but her voice stronger than ever. Behind her stood 23 citizens who'd filed complaints that had been buried by internal affairs. For too long, she began, the citizens of Atlanta have been told that their experiences didn't matter, that their bruises didn't exist, that their complaints were unfounded. Today we tell them, we believe you. We've always believed you. And now finally, justice believes you too. Deshaun Coleman stepped forward, the man whose beating had been captured on the destroyed dashcam footage. His voice shook as he spoke. Officer Matthews broke 3 of my ribs. When I tried to file a complaint, Lieutenant Grayson told me I was lying, threatened to charge me with filing a false report. I lost my job because I couldn't work during recovery. I lost my apartment. I nearly lost everything. But I never lost the truth. One by one, victims spoke. Maria Rodriguez, whose son was beaten during a traffic stop. Marcus Thompson, who was framed for drug possession after reporting an officer for sexual assault. Sarah Chen, whose husband died in custody under suspicious circumstances that were ruled natural causes without an autopsy. Each story was a thread in the tapestry of corruption that Kane and his cohorts had woven. Each voice was a testament to the human cost of unchecked power. Agent Morrison watched from the back of the room, her phone buzzing with constant updates from her team. They'd uncovered something massive in Torres's home safe. Not just financial records, but photographs and videos. Blackmail material on judges, politicians, business leaders. The union had been running an extortion ring using compromising material to ensure favorable treatment for officers. One video showed a prominent city councilman in a compromising situation with someone who wasn't his wife. Another showed a judge accepting an envelope full of cash. The corruption wasn't just deep, it was systemic, reaching into every level of city government. Morrison stepped out to call Director Johnson. "Sir, we need more resources. This is bigger than just the police department. We're looking at public corruption on a massive scale." How many potential defendants? At current count, over 100, and that's just the primary actors. If we include everyone who took bribes or looked the other way, we're talking about hundreds more. Jesus Christ. All right, I'm sending 40 more agents and a team from the Public Integrity Section. Rachel, this is going to be the largest corruption prosecution in DOJ history. Don't screw it up. As Morrison ended the call, she saw Commissioner Hayes being escorted into the building in handcuffs. He'd been arrested at his home that morning, charged with 37 counts, including conspiracy, obstruction, and accessory after the fact to assault. Hayes looked older, defeated, his usual commanding presence reduced to a shuffle. As he passed Morrison, he stopped for a moment. "Agent Morrison," he said quietly, "I want to make a deal." "That's up to the prosecutor's commissioner. I have information about Tampa, about what really happened to Miguel Fernandez." Morrison's eyes sharpened. Fernandez was a witness who disappeared 5 years ago, the night before he was supposed to testify against the department. His body had never been found. "Are you confessing to murder, Commissioner?" Hayes's lawyer intervened. "My client will discuss this only with full immunity for that specific incident." But Morrison shook her head. "No immunity for murder. He can cooperate and maybe avoid the death penalty, but that's all we're offering." As Hayes was led away, Morrison realized they were about to uncover not just corruption, but potentially multiple murders. The Atlanta Police Department hadn't just been corrupt, it had been a criminal organization wearing badges. In his holding cell, Kane heard about Hayes's arrest and felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and dread. Hayes had been his mentor, the one who'd taught him how to manage problems, how to work the system. Now they were both facing life in prison, their legacy reduced to a cautionary tale about the corruption of power. But there was one more revelation coming, one that would shake even the hardened federal investigators. Detective Martinez. The woman who'd warned about the planned raids arrived at the federal building with a box of documents she'd been hiding for 3 years. "I've been investigating from the inside," she told Morrison and her team. "These are cases that were never even officially filed. Victims who were threatened into silence before they could make complaints. Officers who were killed and had it ruled suicide or accident when they tried to speak out." She pulled out a file marked Officer Timothy Chen, Suicide, 2019. Tim didn't kill himself. He was about to testify to the state attorney about the department's connection to organized crime. The night before his deposition, he supposedly shot himself in his car. But look at the autopsy photos, the angle's wrong for self-infliction. And his backup weapon, the one supposedly used, was never found at the scene. It appeared in evidence lockup 3 days later, wiped clean, except for his prints on the trigger. Morrison studied the files, each one representing not just a crime, but a conspiracy to conceal murder. How many? 7 officers in the last 5 years, all ruled suicide or accident. All were about to expose something. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. They weren't just investigating corruption, they were investigating a death squad operating within the police department. "Detective Martinez," Morrison said formally, "we're placing you in immediate protective custody, and we're reopening every one of these cases." As Martinez was escorted to a safe house, she passed by the holding cells where Kane sat waiting for his next interview. Their eyes met for a moment, and Kane saw in her expression something he'd never expected: pity. She pitied him for what he'd become, for the choices he'd made, for the souls he'd sold for power. That night, as the FBI continued their raids and arrests, as more officers flipped and provided information, as the entire structure of corruption began to collapse, Judge Pierce stood in her office looking out at the city lights. Her shoulder still ached, but it was a reminder of what she'd endured and survived. Her clerk knocked and entered. "Your Honor, there's been a development. 3 more judges have come forward admitting they took bribes from the union. They're offering to resign and cooperate." The infection ran deeper than even she had imagined. But at least now it was being exposed to sunlight, the disinfectant of transparency, burning away years of rot. "Schedule a meeting with the chief judge," Pierce said. "We're going to need to review every case those judges touched for the last decade. Every conviction, every dismissal, everything." The task was monumental, but necessary. Justice delayed had been justice denied for too many people for too long. Now it was time to balance the scales. The federal courthouse conference room had been transformed into a war room. Evidence boxes lined the walls, whiteboards covered with connection diagrams, and at the center table, Agent Morrison faced Michael Torres for the first time. The union president sat shackled, his attorney beside him, but his eyes still held defiance, the look of a man who believed he had cards yet to play. "Mr. Torres." Morrison began sliding a photograph across the table. "Do you recognize this man?" The photo showed Officer Timothy Chen, the supposed suicide from 2019. Torres didn't flinch. Tim Chen, troubled officer, took his own life. Tragic. Morrison slid another photo across Chen's autopsy, showing the impossible angle of the gunshot. Troubled enough to shoot himself from an angle his arm couldn't reach. Torres's attorney, William Rothstein, intervened. "Agent Morrison, unless you have evidence linking my client to Officer Chen's death, this fishing expedition—" "We have evidence," Morrison interrupted, producing a document. "Your client's personal calendar from 2019 recovered from his encrypted cloud storage. The night Chen died, Torres had a meeting marked TC problem, permanent solution required. Want to explain that?" For the first time, Torres's composure cracked. He glanced at his attorney, who looked equally stunned. They hadn't known the FBI had cracked the encryption. "I want to make a deal," Torres said suddenly, ignoring Rothstein's attempt to silence him. "Michael, don't say another word." "Shut up, Bill. They have enough to bury me." Torres looked at Morrison directly. "Full immunity, and I'll give you everything. The murders, the money, the network, everything." Morrison leaned back. "You're confessing to murder. I'm confessing to knowing about murders, authorizing payments for them, but I didn't pull any triggers." Torres' voice was steady now, the calculation of a survivor. "There's a unit within the department, they call themselves the Cleaners. 7 officers who handle problems that can't be solved legally. Chen was going to expose them, so they handled him." The room's temperature seemed to drop. Morrison's team exchanged glances. They'd suspected something like this, but confirmation was chilling. "Names," Morrison demanded. Torres rattled off 7 names, each one sending shockwaves through the investigation. 3 were sergeants still on active duty. 2 were detectives in major crimes. 1 was a captain in internal affairs. The 7th name made Morrison's blood run cold. Deputy Chief Harrison Kane's own second-in-command. "Harrison runs the cleaners," Morrison asked. "Has for 6 years. Kane knows about them but keeps his hands clean. Plausible deniability. Harrison handles the wet work, Kane provides cover from above." Morrison immediately texted her team to arrest Harrison before he could flee or destroy evidence. But the response came back negative. Harrison had failed to report for his scheduled FBI interview that morning. His home was empty, his car gone. In a motel room 40 miles outside Atlanta, Harrison watched the news coverage while loading weapons into a duffel bag. He'd known this day would come, eventually had prepared for it. Fake identification cash reserves, safe houses he'd learned from the best criminals he'd supposedly been arresting for 20 years. His phone buzzed. A text from a blocked number. "The shop is closed. All inventory must be cleared. Code." The cleaners were being activated for one last job: eliminate everyone who could testify about their existence. Harrison knew what that meant. Torres had flipped, which meant Harrison himself was now a target. The cleaners didn't tolerate loose ends, even among themselves. He grabbed his bag and headed for the door, but stopped when he heard footsteps in the hallway. Too heavy for housekeeping, too synchronized for regular guests. He moved to the window, saw 2 men in civilian clothes positioning themselves by the stairwell. Not FBI, they moved wrong. These were cleaners. Harrison pulled his service weapon knowing he had seconds before they breached. The bitter irony wasn't lost on him. The unit he'd created to eliminate threats was now coming for him. The door exploded inward. Harrison fired twice, catching the first man center mass, but the second was already moving, diving behind the bed. Gunfire erupted drywall, exploding as bullets punched through the thin motel walls. "Give it up, Harrison," the surviving cleaner shouted. "You know how this ends." Harrison recognized the voice, Sergeant Dennis Murphy, a man he'd personally recruited 5 years ago. "Dennis, we can both walk away from this." "No walking away now, Chief. Orders are orders." More footsteps in the hallway. Reinforcements. Harrison made a decision, diving through the window in a shower of glass, hitting the parking lot hard. His shoulders separated on impact, but adrenaline kept him moving. Behind him, shouts and more gunfire. He reached his car, fumbled for keys with his good hand, managed to start the engine as the rear window exploded. Tires squealing, he tore out of the parking lot, blood running down his arm, knowing he had minutes before they mobilized pursuit. But Harrison had one advantage: he knew where they'd go next. If the cleaners were eliminating witnesses, there was a list, and he knew who was on it. Detective Angela Martinez, who'd been investigating them from the inside. Officer Patricia Ruiz, who'd flipped to the feds. And Judge Pierce herself, the catalyst who'd brought everything crashing down. He grabbed his phone, dialed 911. "This is Deputy Chief Harrison. I need to speak to the FBI immediately. There's going to be an assassination attempt on Judge Pierce within the hour." Back at the federal building, Morrison received the call with skepticism that turned to alarm as Harrison provided specific details. "They'll use the parking garage again, symbolic. Make it look like retaliation for her testimony. 2 shooters, probably Murphy and Detective Carl Williams. They have a schedule of her movements. No, she always leaves through the same exit." "Why should we believe you?" Morrison asked. "Because I'm probably dead either way. But maybe, just maybe, if I help you stop them, you'll remember that when it comes to sentencing." Morrison was already mobilizing units to the courthouse, but she kept Harrison on the line. "Where are you now?" "Mobile, bleeding. They shot me at the motel. Agent Morrison. There's something else you need to know. The cleaners have a list, 17 names of potential witnesses. They're going to hit them all tonight. It's their extinction protocol. Send me the list." "I don't have it memorized. but there's a copy in my office safe. Combination is 31 to 4517. Morrison dispatched a team immediately while coordinating protection details for every known witness. The investigation had just transformed into a race against time. Judge Pierce received the warning in her chambers, Marshal Chen and 3 other marshals immediately surrounding her. "Your Honor, we need to move you to a secure location immediately." "No," Pierce said firmly. "If they want me, let them come. But this time we'll be ready." "Your Honor, with respect." "Marshal, they've operated in shadows for years because people ran, people hid. I'm done running. Set up your protection, but I'm staying visible. Let them know that federal judges don't intimidate." It was a bold stance, but Pierce understood the symbolism. If she hid, the cleaners won a victory even if they never fired a shot. The system's credibility depended on standing firm. At Atlanta PD headquarters, chaos reigned as news of the cleaners spread. Officers who'd thought they were part of a brotherhood realized they'd been working alongside assassins. Trust evaporated instantly. Partners who'd worked together for years suddenly viewed each other with suspicion. Captain Janet Morrison, no relation to the FBI agent, stood before her squad, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Everyone stops what they're doing right now. Weapons on the table, phones surrendered. Internal Affairs, what's left of it, is conducting immediate interviews. Anyone who knows anything about the cleaners and doesn't speak up will be charged as an accessory." Detective Carl Williams sat in the back of the room, sweating despite the air conditioning. He was one of the cleaners, and Captain Morrison was staring right at him. Did she know? Was this theater before his arrest? His phone vibrated, a burner hidden in his boot. The extinction protocol had been activated, but he was trapped in a room full of cops, half of whom would probably shoot him if they knew what he was. "Williams," Captain Morrison called out, "you're first for interview." He stood slowly, mind racing. He could run, but where? He could fight, but he was outnumbered 50-1. He could cooperate, but the cleaners would find him eventually. "Actually, Captain," he said, his voice surprisingly steady, "I need to speak to the FBI, immediately." The room erupted. Other officers reached for weapons they'd just surrendered, shouts of, "Cleaner!" and "Take him down!" filling the air. Williams raised his hands, backing against the wall. "I want to turn myself in. I have information about the attacks tonight." Captain Morrison restored order with sharp commands, then approached Williams carefully. "You're admitting to being a cleaner." "I'm admitting to wanting to live through the night. The extinction protocol means everyone dies, witnesses and cleaners alike. No loose ends. I know where Murphy's heading, who the targets are. But I need protection." Within minutes, Williams was in an FBI vehicle spilling everything to Agent Morrison's team. The cleaners' structure, their methods, their contacts throughout the department and city government. Each revelation was another piece of a horrifying puzzle. "Harrison recruited me 3 years ago." Williams explained, his hands cuffed, but his tongue loosened by fear. "Said there were threats the legal system couldn't handle. Made it sound patriotic, like we were protecting the city. First job was just intimidation, scare a witness into recanting, but it escalated. By the time I realized what we'd become, I was in too deep." "How many murders?" Morrison asked. "That I participated in 3. That I know about at least a dozen, maybe more." Harrison compartmentalized everything. We only knew what we needed to know. Meanwhile, Harrison had made it to an urgent care clinic, paying cash for treatment under a fake name. The doctor, a young resident, was suspicious, but Harrison's police credentials, fake ones he'd prepared for this contingency, satisfied her enough to treat him without calling it in. As she worked on his shoulder, Harrison watched the news on the waiting room TV. The FBI had raided his office, found his safe. His carefully constructed world was collapsing, but he still had one card to play: information about the deeper conspiracy, the one even Torres didn't know about. His phone rang. Unknown number. "Harrison!" The voice was electronically disguised, but he recognized the speech patterns. You've become a liability. Judge Kowalski, Harrison said, causing the doctor to look up sharply. Surprised you're calling directly. The silence on the other end confirmed his guess. Superior Court Judge Martin Kowalski. The one who'd consistently ruled in the department's favor, who'd dismissed civil rights lawsuits, who'd sealed records that should have been public. You have 1 hour to surrender yourself, Kowalski said. After that, you're on your own. I'm already on my own. But here's the thing, Martin, I kept recordings. Every bribe, every fixed case, every time you perverted justice for a payoff. You burn me, I burn the entire judicial system. You're bluffing. Check your email. Harrison sent a single audio file, Kowalski accepting $100,000 to dismiss a wrongful death suit against the department. The judge's voice was clear, unmistakable. There are 40 more files like that. Harrison lied. There were only 12, but Kowalski didn't know that. Dead man's switch. If I don't enter a code every 12 hours, they go to every news outlet in the country. Another silence. Then, what do you want? Safe passage out of the country, new identity, and $5 million from the war chest. Impossible. Then I guess we'll both be wearing orange jumpsuits. Your call. Harrison ended the call, knowing he'd just signed his own death warrant. But he'd also bought time. Kowalski would need to consult with others, figure out their next move. That gave Harrison maybe 6 hours before they came for him with everything they had. Back at the federal courthouse, the trap was set. Judge Pierce sat in her office, apparently working late, while 24 federal agents took positions throughout the building. Surveillance showed Murphy and another cleaner sergeant, Ray Collins, approaching in a stolen van. They're using city maintenance uniforms, Chen reported over radio. Fake work order to check the garage ventilation system. Morrison coordinated the response from the command center. Let them enter. We need them to commit to the attempted murder of a federal judge carries life without parole. Pierce continued working, though her bulletproof vest under her robes made every movement uncomfortable. She could see the garage on her monitor watch the two cleaners enter with their equipment bags undoubtedly containing weapons. They're in the elevator, Chen reported. Moving to your floor. Pierce felt her heart rate spike but kept her hands steady. This was it, the confrontation that would either end the cleaners or make her their most famous victim. The elevator dinged. Footsteps in the hallway. Pierce touched the panic button that would signal the agents to move, but waited. They needed the cleaners to fully commit. Her office door opened slowly. Murphy entered first, no longer pretending to be maintenance. His weapon was drawn, suppressor attached. Judge Pierce, he said calmly. This isn't personal. It never is with people like you, Pierce replied, her hand still on the panic button. Just following orders, right? Just doing what needs to be done. You don't understand what you've started, Murphy said, advancing slowly. The system you're tearing down, it kept this city safe. Crime rates down, streets peaceful. Sometimes justice needs a heavy hand. And sometimes that hand needs to be cut off, Pierce said, pressing the button. The response was instantaneous. Agents burst through doors, windows, even ceiling panels. Murphy spun, firing twice before multiple tasers brought him down. Collins tried to flee, but ran directly into Marshal Chen, who put him on the ground with a single strike. Dennis Murphy, Ray Collins, you're under arrest for attempted murder of a federal official, Morrison announced as they were cuffed. And that's just the beginning of your charges. Murphy laughed from the floor, blood running from his nose. You think you've won? You have no idea how deep this goes. Judges, prosecutors, politicians, half this city is on the take. You arrest us, 10 more take our place. Then we'll arrest them too, Morrison replied. Every last one. As Murphy and Collins were led away, Pierce finally allowed herself to slump in her chair. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving her exhausted. But they'd done it. The cleaners were broken, their leadership dead or arrested. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. You think you've won, but the war is just beginning. Check your home security cameras. Pierce's blood ran cold. She pulled up her home security app, saw figures moving through her house. They weren't trying to hide, they wanted her to see them. One figure stepped into clear view of the camera and removed their mask. It was Commissioner Hayes. "Hello, Judge," Hayes said to the camera, knowing she was watching. "We need to talk about your future. You have 1 hour to come here alone, or we release certain photographs that your daughter wouldn't want made public. Yes, we know about her girlfriend, the one her conservative college doesn't know about. Amazing what people share on social media when they think they're safe." Pierce felt rage building. They were threatening her daughter, using her personal life as leverage. But she also recognized the desperation in the move. Hayes was cornered, lashing out. She looked at Morrison. "They're at my house. Hayes and probably others." Morrison immediately began coordinating units to Pierce's residence, but Pierce held up her hand. "Wait. If we spook them, they might release whatever they have on my daughter. Let me talk to them first." "Absolutely not. Your Honor, that's exactly what they want." "Agent Morrison, my daughter is at Stanford. She's 22, brilliant, and yes, she's gay. If they out her to that conservative scholarship board, she loses everything she's worked for. I can't let that happen. We can protect her." Can you really guarantee that some anonymous email won't destroy her life? Because I can't take that chance." Pierce stood, removing her bulletproof vest. "But I'm not going alone. You'll be right behind me. Give me 15 minutes to get them talking. Then come in hard." Morrison wanted to refuse, but saw the determination in Pierce's eyes. This was personal now, and Pierce had the right to face her tormentors. 10 minutes, Morrison countered, "and you wear a wire." As Pierce was fitted with a microphone across the city, Kane sat in his safe house, watching the news coverage. The cleaners exposed Hayes arrested, and now apparently taking hostages the entire structure he'd helped build, crumbling in real time. His handler, Agent Davis, watched him carefully. "Anything you want to add to your statement? Anything about the cleaners you forgot to mention?" Kane laughed bitterly. "I told you Harrison handled that side. I knew they existed, but kept myself insulated. Plausible deniability." "That's not going to fly anymore, Chief. Williams is talking. He says you personally ordered 2 of the hits." Kane's face went pale. "That's impossible. I never—" Officer Patricia Chen, 2018, threatened to expose the department's connection to drug dealers. "Williams says you told Harrison to handle the Chen problem permanently. She died in a car accident 2 weeks later, brake lines cut." Kane's mind raced. He remembered Chen remembered the threat she posed, remembered telling Harrison to handle it. But he'd meant transfer her sideline, her not. "I didn't mean kill her," Kane said weakly. "That's what every mob boss says. But when you tell your enforcer to handle someone permanently, there's only one interpretation." Davis pulled out additional documents. "You're being charged with conspiracy to commit murder, multiple counts." Kane saw his future crystallizing, not minimum security for corruption, but life in Supermax for murder. The deal he'd made suddenly seemed worthless. "I want to amend my cooperation," Kane said urgently. "There's more, so much more. The cleaners were just one unit. There's another group, they call themselves the Shadows. They don't kill. They destroy lives through other means. Planted evidence, false arrests, psychiatric holds for people who ask too many questions." Davis leaned forward. This was new intelligence. "Keep talking." But before Kane could continue, alarms started blaring. The safe house was under attack. Windows shattered as tear gas canisters flew in. Davis grabbed Kane, pulling him toward the panic room as gunfire erupted outside. The cleaners' extinction protocol had found them. Even in custody, even cooperating, Kane wasn't safe. The corruption he'd fostered had become a monster that would devour even its creators. In the panic room, Davis called for backup, while Kane huddled in the corner, finally understanding the true price of the power he'd wielded. Every person he'd failed to protect, every crime he'd covered up, every life destroyed by his department's corruption, it had all led to this moment, cowering in a reinforced box, while his former subordinates tried to kill him. "They won't stop," Kane said, his voice broken. "Even if you arrest them all, there are more. Other cities, other departments. We were part of a network, a brotherhood that spans the entire country. Atlanta was just one node." Davis stared at him. "Are you saying this corruption is nationwide?" "I'm saying you've kicked over an anthill, and you're about to find out how deep the colony goes." Outside, the gunfire intensified. The cleaners had come to tie up loose ends, but they were about to learn that the FBI had anticipated this move. Tactical teams had been positioned around all protected witnesses, waiting for exactly this kind of assault. The battle for justice in Atlanta was escalating into a war, and everyone, cops, criminals, judges, and citizens, was about to choose a side. The gunfire outside the safe house suddenly stopped. The silence was more terrifying than the bullets had been. Davis kept his weapon trained on the panic room door, while Kane huddled in the corner, his entire body trembling. Then they heard it, the sound of measured footsteps approaching. "Agent Davis," a familiar voice called through the reinforced door. "This is Agent Morrison. The threat has been neutralized. You can come out." Davis didn't move. In their training, they'd learned about voice mimicry technology, about cleaners who'd studied their targets' speech patterns. "Verify yourself," he called back. "What did you tell me about your daughter this morning?" There was a pause. Then Morrison's voice came back with a hint of amusement. "I don't have a daughter, Davis. I have 3 sons, and this morning I told you the youngest just made the high school debate team. Now open this door before I have it cut open." Davis finally relaxed, entering the code to unlock the panic room. Morrison stood outside her tactical vest, splattered with blood that wasn't hers. Behind her, EMTs were loading wounded cleaners onto stretchers, while FBI agents processed the scene. "How many?" Davis asked. 4 cleaners came for Kane. "We got them all. 2 dead, 2 wounded but stable. They'll live to testify." Morrison looked at Kane with disgust. "Seems like your former employees really wanted you silenced, Chief." Kane couldn't meet her eyes. The weight of his betrayals, the network of corruption he'd helped build, was crushing him. But Morrison wasn't done with him yet. "The nationwide network you mentioned, we need everything. Names, cities, communication methods. This is your only chance to avoid the death penalty for the murders you ordered." Meanwhile, Judge Pierce pulled into her driveway, knowing she was walking into a trap, but seeing no alternative. The FBI tactical team was 3 minutes behind her, hidden in unmarked vans, but 3 minutes could be a lifetime. She saw Hayes through her living room window, sitting in her favorite chair, like he owned the place. 2 other figures moved in the shadows, more cleaners probably. She entered through her front door, keeping her hands visible. The wire under her shirt felt heavy, obvious, but Hayes didn't seem to care about being recorded anymore. He was beyond such concerns now. "Judge Pierce," Hayes said, not getting up. "Thank you for coming. Please sit. We have much to discuss." Pierce remained standing. "You've broken into my home, threatened my daughter, and you want to have a civilized conversation. I want to make a deal, one that benefits everyone." Hayes pulled out a tablet showing a complex financial spreadsheet. "There's $50 million in offshore accounts. Money skimmed from seizures, drug busts, civil forfeitures over 15 years. I'm offering you half to walk away. Drop the federal investigation, cite health concerns, take an early retirement. $25 million, Judge. Your daughter never needs to worry about student loans or anything else." Pierce laughed, actually laughed at the audacity. "You think you can buy me? After what you've done, everyone has a price." "No, Commissioner, not everyone. Some of us actually believe in justice." She stepped closer, knowing the wire was capturing everything. "You want to know my price? It's seeing you and every corrupt officer in your department behind bars. It's giving justice to every family you've destroyed. That's my price, and you're about to pay it." Hayes's expression darkened. He stood, and that's when Pierce saw the gun in his waistband. "I was hoping you'd be reasonable. But if you won't take the money, maybe you'll be more motivated by this." He pulled out his phone, showed her a video. It was her daughter at Stanford, walking across campus, unaware she was being filmed. The timestamp was from today, just hours ago. "I have people there right now," Hayes said. "One word from me, and she has an accident. Tragic, random. The kind of thing that happens sometimes." Pierce felt ice in her veins, but also rage. Pure, incandescent rage. "You're threatening to kill my daughter. I'm explaining your options. Retire quietly, or lose everything that matters." That's when Pierce noticed something Hayes hadn't: a red laser dot dancing on the window behind him. The FBI snipers were in position. She just needed to give the signal. "Commissioner Hayes," she said formally, clearly knowing every word was being recorded. "You're threatening to murder my daughter if I don't drop a federal investigation. Is that correct?" Hayes seemed to realize his mistake too late. Is that correct?" Pierce's voice thundered with judicial authority. Before Hayes could respond, the front door exploded inward. Flashbang grenades filled the room with blinding light and deafening sound. Pierce hit the floor as FBI agents swarmed in screaming commands. Hayes reached for his gun, but never made it. 3 agents tackled him, driving him into the ground with enough force to crack the hardwood. The 2 cleaners in the shadows tried to flee, but ran directly into the tactical team coming through the back. In seconds, it was over. Hayes and his accomplices were face down, cuffed, their plan in ruins. Morrison helped Pierce to her feet. "Your daughter's safe. We've had protective surveillance on her since yesterday. Anyone who got close would have been intercepted." Pierce nodded, still shaking from adrenaline. "Did you get it all? The confession?" "Every word. Attempted extortion, conspiracy to commit murder, threatening a federal official. Hayes just added another 30 years to his sentence." As Hayes was dragged out, he looked back at Pierce with pure hatred. "You've destroyed everything. The whole city will burn without us keeping order." "No," Pierce replied calmly. "It will finally heal." The next morning brought a tsunami of revelations. The FBI released portions of the recorded confessions, and the public finally understood the depth of corruption that had infected their police force. News crews surrounded the federal courthouse as a parade of officers were brought in for arraignment. Kane, now the prosecution's star witness, sat in a secure conference room, providing detailed testimony about the nationwide network. He named departments in 17 cities that were part of the corruption ring, described how they shared tactics for avoiding federal oversight, how they coordinated to silence witnesses who might expose them. Chicago, Detroit, Baltimore, New Orleans. Kane recited each name, another domino about to fall. "We had monthly conference calls, called ourselves the Brotherhood of Shields. Anyone who threatened one department was seen as a threat to all." Agent Morrison's team was frantically coordinating with FBI offices nationwide, preparing simultaneous raids. This was no longer just about Atlanta. It was about dismantling a criminal organization that had infiltrated law enforcement across America. But the corruption fought back. In Detroit, a federal prosecutor's car exploded in his driveway. He survived only because he'd gone back inside for forgotten files. In Chicago, witnesses began recanting their statements after family members received threats. In Baltimore, crucial evidence mysteriously disappeared from federal custody. The Brotherhood of Shields was activating its defensive protocols, and bodies started dropping. 3 witnesses in different cities died in accidents within 6 hours. The message was clear: cooperate with the feds and die. Judge Pierce convened an emergency meeting with federal judges from the affected districts via secure video conference. The situation was spiraling beyond what any of them had anticipated. "We need witness protection for hundreds of people," Judge Martinez from Chicago said. "The Marshal Service doesn't have those resources." "Then we need military assistance," Pierce responded. "This is domestic terrorism. The National Guard, federal troops if necessary. We're at war with corruption itself." The Attorney General joined the call. "Judge Pierce, what you're suggesting is unprecedented. Military deployment against American law enforcement." "Against corrupt law enforcement that's murdering witnesses," Pierce corrected. "We're beyond normal judicial procedures. They've shown they'll kill anyone who threatens them. We need extraordinary measures." Within hours, the president signed an emergency order. Joint military FBI task forces were deployed to 17 cities. The sight of armored vehicles surrounding police stations made international news. America was confronting its own corrupted institutions with military force. In Atlanta, the trials began even as the investigation continued. Kane took the stand in a heavily fortified courthouse bulletproof glass separating him from the gallery. His testimony was devastating, each word dismantling the mythology of the thin blue line. "We called citizens civilians, like we were an occupying army," Kane testified. "We were trained to see everyone as a potential threat to control through fear. When someone filed a complaint, we didn't see a citizen exercising their rights, we saw an enemy to be neutralized." The prosecutor Jennifer Walsh guided him through specific incidents. "Tell us about the Martinez family." Kane's voice cracked. Roberto Martinez was stopped for a broken taillight. The officer thought he saw him reach for something. Shot him 7 times. Roberto was reaching for his registration. "We planted a knife in his car, said he'd threatened the officer with it." Gasps from the gallery. Roberto's widow sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face, but her expression triumphant. Finally, the truth was being told. "Who authorized planting the knife?" "I did. Hayes approved it. Grayson handled the paperwork to make it look legitimate." Each confession was another nail in the coffin of the old system. But Kane wasn't done. He had one more revelation, one he'd been holding back even from the FBI. "There's something else," he said, looking directly at Judge Pierce. "The night you were assaulted, it wasn't random. We knew you were reviewing the Coleman case. But that's not why I was there." The courtroom fell silent. Even the prosecutors looked confused. "Judge Thompson had called me," Kane continued, naming another federal judge. "He said you were getting too close to something bigger than police corruption. Something about city development contracts, federal construction projects. He wanted you scared off before you found it." Pierce felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Judge Thompson was the chief judge of the Northern District, her mentor, the man who'd recommended her for her position. Morrison immediately sent agents to Thompson's chambers, but they were too late. Thompson was gone, his office cleared out, his computer's hard drive removed. But he'd made one mistake. His secretary, loyal for 20 years, had kept copies of everything. Within hours, they had evidence of a corruption network that made the police scandal look small. Federal judges taking bribes to approve development projects, city council members rezoning land for kickbacks, construction companies owned by shell corporations linked to organized crime. The police corruption had been just one tentacle of a much larger beast. Thompson was arrested at the airport trying to board a flight to a non-extradition country. As he was led away in handcuffs, he passed Pierce in the federal building's hallway. "You have no idea what you've done," he said. "The people involved in this, they don't just kill you. They destroy everything you've ever touched. Your family, your friends, everyone." "Then we'd better get them all," Pierce replied. The trials continued for months. One by one, the corrupt officers were convicted. Kane got 25 years eligible for parole and 15 with good behavior. Hayes got life without parole for the murders he'd orchestrated. Grayson died in custody, officially suicide, though many suspected the Brotherhood had silenced him. But the biggest victory came when Torres, the union president, provided financial records showing the full extent of the corruption. The money trail led to senators, congressmen, even a deputy director at the Justice Department. The investigation that had started with a shove in a parking garage had exposed corruption at the highest levels of government. 1 year later, Judge Pierce stood in the reformed Atlanta Police Department headquarters. The building had been gutted and rebuilt, just like the department itself. New leadership, new policies, new culture. Every officer now wore body cameras that couldn't be turned off. An independent civilian review board investigated all complaints. Use of force had dropped by 70%. The new chief, Maria Rodriguez, promoted from a suburban department specifically because she'd had no connection to the old regime, invited Pierce to address the graduating class of new officers. Pierce looked out at the young faces, diverse in every way, and felt hope. A year ago, this department was a criminal organization with badges. Today, you're joining a police force that truly serves and protects. The difference: accountability, transparency, the understanding that no badge stands above the Constitution. She touched her shoulder where the injury from Kane's assault had left permanent damage. I carry a reminder of what happens when power goes unchecked. You will carry the responsibility to ensure it never happens again. Every time you put on that uniform, remember you serve the people, not the other way around. As the ceremony ended, Pierce walked through the memorial garden that had been created for victims of police violence. Each name on the wall represented a failure of the system, but also a promise to do better. Deputy Patricia Ruiz, now Captain Ruiz in the Reform Department, joined her. Thank you, Judge, for everything. You could have just pressed charges for the assault and moved on. Instead, you brought down an empire of corruption. I didn't do it alone, Pierce replied. You, Detective Martinez, Detective Washington officers who chose justice over loyalty. You're the real heroes. Morrison approached, now heading the FBI's new National Police Integrity Task Force. Judge, we just got confirmation. The last of the Brotherhood cells has been dismantled. Took down a group in Philadelphia this morning. It's over. Pierce nodded, but she knew better. Corruption was like a virus. You could suppress it, but never truly eliminate it. The price of justice was eternal vigilance. That evening, Pierce sat in her chambers reviewing cases. Her daughter called from Stanford, excited about her new internship at the ACLU, inspired by her mother's courage to pursue civil rights law. Mom, what you did standing up to them, even when they threatened me, I'm so proud of you. I'm proud of you too, sweetheart. Change doesn't come from one person standing up. It comes from inspiring others to stand with you. After the call, Pierce looked out at the city lights. Atlanta had survived its trial by fire. The police department that had once been a symbol of corruption was becoming a model for reform. Federal oversight would continue for 5 more years, but already other cities were adopting Atlanta's new policies. Kane in his federal cell watched the news coverage of the Reform Department. Part of him felt bitter seeing his life's work dismantled. But another part, a part that had been buried under years of corruption, felt something else. Relief. The weight of all those covered-up crimes, all those buried complaints, was finally off his shoulders. He'd received a letter from Roberto Martinez's widow. Not forgiveness, he didn't deserve that, but acknowledgement that his testimony had finally brought her family truth. It was more grace than he'd earned. The guard arrived for evening count. Kane, you've got a visitor. It was his son, the rookie cop from another state. They hadn't spoken since the arrest. Through the reinforced glass, Kane could see his son still in uniform, the badge his father had once worn with such twisted pride, now worn with genuine honor. Dad, his son said, his voice thick with emotion. I wanted you to know I'm testifying next week to the Reform Commission about how to prevent another Atlanta. Kane nodded, unable to speak. His legacy wouldn't be the corruption he'd fostered, but the reforms his downfall had sparked. It was a bitter irony, but perhaps a just one. As the months turned to years, the Atlanta model became the standard for police reform nationwide. Body cameras, civilian oversight, federal monitoring, and swift prosecution of corruption. Crime rates, rather than rising, as Hayes had predicted, fell to historic lows. Communities that had feared the police began to trust them again. Judge Pierce eventually retired from the bench, her shoulder injury making the long hours too difficult. But she didn't stop fighting. She founded the Pierce Institute for Justice Reform, training judges, prosecutors, and police officers in constitutional law and ethics. At the Institute's opening ceremony, she stood before a crowd that included victims' families, reformed officers, and federal officials who'd fought the corruption. Behind her, a quote was etched in marble: "No badge stands above the Constitution." 5 years ago, Pierce began her speech, a police chief forgot that simple truth. His violence against me exposed a network of corruption that infected law enforcement across our nation. But from that darkness came light. From that violence came reform. From that corruption came a renewed commitment to justice. She looked out at the crowd, seeing faces of people who'd suffered under the old system, and those working to build the new one. The price of justice is eternal vigilance. The moment we stop watching, stop demanding accountability, corruption creeps back in. So we must never stop, never forget, never allow power to place itself above law. As she spoke across the city in federal prison, Bryson Kane sat in the prison library teaching literacy to other inmates. It was his small attempt at redemption, using the education he'd once wielded as a weapon to help others. He'd never be free again, but perhaps he could help others avoid his path. The Brotherhood of Shields was broken. The cleaners were imprisoned or dead. The corrupt judges and politicians had fallen. But most importantly, the culture had changed. New officers were trained to see themselves as guardians, not warriors. Community policing replaced aggressive enforcement. Trust slowly rebuilt between police and citizens. On the anniversary of the parking garage assault, Judge Pierce returned to that spot. The garage had been renovated, brightened with a plaque commemorating it as the place where the fight for justice reform began. Marshal Chen met her there, now head of federal courthouse security. "Any regrets, Your Honor?" he asked. Pierce touched her shoulder, feeling the permanent ache that cold weather brought. "None. Pain fades, but justice endures. We proved that no one is above the law, not police chiefs, not commissioners, not judges. That's worth any price." As she walked back into the courthouse, Pierce passed a group of law students on a tour. Their professor was explaining the events that had started there, the courage it took to stand against corruption. One student raised her hand. Judge Pierce faced death threats, assault, and attempts on her life. Why didn't she just back down? The professor smiled. "Because some things are worth fighting for no matter the cost. Justice is one of them." Pierce continued walking, but she smiled. The next generation understood. They would carry the torch forward, ensuring that the sacrifices made and lessons learned wouldn't be forgotten. The transformation of Atlanta's police department from a criminal organization to a model of reform had taken years, cost millions, and required unprecedented federal intervention. But it had proven something crucial: even the deepest corruption could be rooted out if enough people had the courage to stand against it. As the sun set over Atlanta, the city that had once symbolized police corruption now stood as a beacon of hope for reform. The badge that had once been used to oppress now protected and served. The Constitution that had been ignored now guided every action. Chief Bryson Kane's violent shove in that parking garage had started an avalanche that buried corruption and cleared the path for justice. It was a reminder that sometimes the worst actions of the powerful become the catalyst for their own downfall. The fight for justice never truly ends, it just passes to new guardians. And in Atlanta, those guardians now wore badges backed not by fear, but by the full faith and trust of the communities they served. Justice had prevailed, the Constitution had endured, and no badge would ever stand above the law again.